Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, everyone. Um, Hopefully, we're all ready for a lecture that involves something I would say during the time of Ramadan. It maybe it's going to be pushing us, hopefully, inshallah, into
Recording in progress.
a different kind of motivation. And we did actually talk about spirituality in Islam before, and we went through a number of different things, but we couldn't complete talking about this topic because of time. So, hopefully, inshallah, we'll be able to do that. So, before we talked about what is spirituality, and we said in the different things that comes to people's minds when we're talking about spirituality, and I said that the most important thing when we're speaking about spirituality in Islam, and which makes it different than other religions, is that how Islam views that you can't attain spirituality unless you actually put your vision, your behavior, and your spirit, in other words, your sincerity, all together to be lined up to do the exact same thing, to be doing one purpose, which is really the purpose that a person was created for before before even their existence. And in other words, it was designed before their existence. And in other religions, on the other hand, is that there's a difference between the soul and the body is either seen as something that is taking away. In other words, it's supposed to be fighting the soul, and therefore the a monk would mortify the soul, probably put themselves in coal, hot burning coal, or they might actually attempt to probably drink different disgusting things, etc., just like Buddha did. So you'll see one side, and then you'll see another side that regards that, well, the soul is trying to get the spirituality, and whatever you do with your body, it doesn't make a difference. And that's why you will see this is really common right now within the West, in where the practice of yoga in order to attain some form of spirituality, but at the same time, no concern about what a behavior or any do's and don'ts and what you eat and etc. Well, sometimes they'll speak about vegetarian, but that's a group of people a different from a different source. And of course, you could see that this is unfortunately becoming a trend where Muslims want to practice their spirituality, but forget that Islam actually has its own resources to understand spirituality, and it's very different. In fact, it has nothing to do with how the different religions actually practice, or different philosophies and how they practice spirituality, because in Islam there's a whole system, it's a whole vision, and the way you practice spirituality actually starts from La ilaha illallah, from the very beginning of that vision, from the vision of Tawheed. And we did actually mention that when we're talking about the body and soul, we said they're not in conflict. But when we speak about certain things that are haram, or in practices, or probably in what we do, um, doesn't necessarily mean that we are fighting the body, but it means that we're putting the body to a balance to live a certain principle. And living this certain principle was really in order to attain a certain level of focus. So the certain level of focus is actually the spirituality in Islam. So when you are able to bring about a focus towards your principle, towards your relationship with the Lord Almighty, which is the level, which really starts with the level of Islam. So the beginning of that level of spirituality is called the level of Islam. The second level, which is when you put in more and more behavior, that's called the level of Iman. And then the third level, when you increase not only in your behavior, but your behavior is consistent with your vision that is Islam, and the stronger it is, that's when you'll be able to attain the level of ihsan. So when we look at just these lines right there, we can see that when we could see that the whole issue of spirituality is really to put in a certain vision of behavior, a certain vision of purpose, a certain vision of connection with the Lord Almighty. Remember these three things. So when we're actually putting in three items, remember in your mind vision, behavior, and sincerity. نحن له مسلمون, نحن له عابدون, and نحن له مخلصون. Those are three different elements. So I'm trying to connect the different lectures that I'm doing together. So in order for us to keep those ideas in place and be consistent with the different viewpoints that we actually lay out. So when we actually say vision, remember we're talking about the purpose. So the main purpose is that we would be tested, but tested in what? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lays out as piece of the test in where we are created to be the khulafa. وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً, in order to fulfill a certain responsibility, a certain duty. But it's not like the Western or the many materialistic understanding or mundane understanding of what it means to create and build a civilization, because in Islam it's not just modernity, but it's actually the ruh, the principle of modernity, and which is why when we look at Khilafah, we're always wanting to speak about justice. We're speaking about justice in where it is maintaining the justice in one, the vision in Tawheed, maintaining the justice in people's lives and for nafs, maintaining the justice in bringing in the right understanding and right education and mental health, which is the DNAIM, so which is the aql, and then maintaining and bringing justice for family. So that's where a lot of times people are confused. So when we're talking about the West, for example, why are we not talking about it as necessarily a civilization? So we would say, well, wait a minute. Yes, it has modernity, but Islam was always emphasizing, the Quran was emphasizing that Fir'aun, for example, although they definitely had a great civilization, but Fir'aun, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasizes whether Fir'aun or whether the people of Ad or the people of Thamud did emphasize that they actually had a great modernity, great civilization, but the civilization was not called a civilization, and it was actually called and emphasized to being a jahiliyyah. Why was it a jahiliyyah? Because the emphasis was on the outer structure and not the spirit and not the soul, and not in line with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created people for, which is the Khilafah. So when you look at that in a great book, it was actually the first book probably that I ever completed in my life when I was in 9th grade. It was written by Muhammad Qutb, not Sayyid Qutb, but Muhammad Qutb. And Muhammad Qutb is actually Sayyid Qutb's brother. He died a couple years ago at age almost 92. But Muhammad Qutb wrote a book. It's called La ilaha illallah, a path. I'm just going to translate the title. La ilaha illallah, a path of life, minhaju hayah, a path of, or a legal maxim for legislature, and also a vision. He was probably, trying to, and by the way, he's actually specialized in English literature, the irony, and wrote a number of different books, amazing books. I hope they get translated. I'm not the person to translate them. All right. So when you look at that viewpoint, and it's really important to understand that why are they not considered as civilizations Well, really, because they lacked, again, it's the beginning of what makes a civilization. They lacked the main connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So remember, you've got five different elements to make a civilization. The beginning and the core, which is when a person has the foundation towards Allah Almighty. And then we're talking about justice in people's lives, and we're talking about justice that is actually that is actually derived from the vision of Tawheed. So when you're looking at behavior, it's not enough to say, well, look, the justice system, for example, in the West is outstanding in many ways. All right, in many ways. And, but then we're going to say, well, wait a minute, look at the vision. When the vision started going off, the further it went off, for example, from Allah Almighty, when it started going away from Allah Almighty, or even if it was a religion like Christianity that is not fully 100% from Allah Almighty, it still contained some level of justice. It still contained some level of akhlaq and mannerism, because it still had basis, it still had some glimpse of the Lord Almighty's principles. But then the farther it went away, the farther you could see that it's bringing in corruption. Farther it went away from Allah Almighty, the more you saw corruption coming in with postmodernism, with all the different lobbying that is right now replacing what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually revealed in terms of morals and ethics and justice and etc. So when we look at spirituality, it has to be in line. In order to get there, it has to be in line with the purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you for. Now the other part is that the body itself and the behavior. So let's do it again. We're talking about the vision, we're talking about the behavior, and we're talking about the sincerity. The behavior itself must actually not function without the soul, which is the sincerity part. So the path for the soul's development is actually in the body and in the soul. So the body is supposed to help you, and the soul, of course, find that way. Now, one very important thing is that when we speak about Islam and spirituality, it's important to remember that Islam rejects living away from responsibilities and proposes methods for the elevation of one's spirituality, and not outside of this world, but within life and your responsibility. So therefore, when we're speaking about increasing your spirituality, we're not saying don't get married, don't get probably into schooling and into the politics and etc., because that is actually part of forming your spirituality. You cannot isolate yourself away from the world thinking that, well, I'm trying to attain spirituality. Well, that's not how it goes. Working your way within the society. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said that being patient over the harm of people is actually closer and better in the eyes of Allah Almighty and to Allah than actually abstaining and ostracizing yourself from the community. And although not everyone is capable, and right now I could see that there is this pressure, or I would say this justification. Let me take out the word pressure and justification, in where the society is becoming more and more, I would say, isolated, in where each and every single individual is trying to look and be comfortable with their isolation, with having that comfort zone in where they're staying away from the society, and it becomes many times, that justification that, well, I'm actually an introvert, so therefore I don't have to get involved. Although some people can be, and find better comfort in being indeed introverts, but at the same time, Islam actually recommends, let me use the word recommends that one gets out of their comfort zone and actually work out the different coping skills in order to change the society and help get relate with one another in order to bring about a change that will involve a lot of, let's say, better change within the society and enhancement for their coping skills and better abilities. And part of the coping skills is actually is sabr and patience and containment on people's harm. But I can't. People would harm me. Yes, even when you are working with people and trying to get into a certain level of stability, that way in where you're trying to pave the way of getting higher and higher in your coping skills. You're strengthening your coping skills, so don't give up. It will take time, but in strengthening your coping skills, you're technically strengthening your vision and your focus, from focusing on wanting an area of comfort to focusing, and it's going to induce you to focus on trying to find ways to learn how to strengthen yourself in connecting yourself with the principle, with the main purpose that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created you for. So what are you actually doing? You're connecting yourself in different ways with the principle, and you're connecting yourself with Allah Almighty by changing the focus from focusing on your area of spirituality to getting an area of spirituality and bringing in the khilafah. So when we're talking about khilafah, don't put me into Hizb al-Tahrir right now. We're not talking about Hizb al-Tahrir and the Islamic governance and all that, but we're actually talking about khilafah to mean applying the principles of the Lord Almighty and making them something that is applied on ground, not by force per se. And we're not talking about force here. That's a political thing that has a different discussion. I'm actually talking about it from a spiritual sense. It doesn't mean that political force and jihad is not a category in Islam. Yes, it is, but that's a different discussion. Right, I'm here talking about it from a spiritual sense. So when we look at spirituality, there are a number of things that we would need to look at. It's like, what is a spiritual decay? How do we actually recognize it? We talked about that in general. Every single person is actually born with an instinct, but the instinct is not talking about just of how we relate. Usually in let's say Western literature, it's animals that have instinct, but in Islam, even human beings, they actually have conscience. So that conscience in where something on the inside, which is that fitra, is giving you that sign that something is wrong. It's that conscience on the inside that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala built within you, that you also want to seek, a purpose in life. You want to seek that. So here's that fitra. And later, when we look at that fitrah, the Prophet ﷺ said each and every single person is actually born with an innate it's kind of like a conscience. This conscience on the inside is actually pure, but it isn't until the society actually changes it. In other words, it contaminates it with the different things within the society, whether we're talking about contamination through vision or contamination through behavior or even with sincerity. So when we look at contamination with vision, the Prophet ﷺ emphasized that and said, and his parents will either make him a Jew, a Christian, or a Zoroastrian. He was talking about the contamination of vision. But in other resources, it does talk about the contamination of behavior, such as in the Quran, talking about the contamination of behavior, in where it talks about, for example, how Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam was speaking to his people about the contamination of behavior that acted as an obstacle from correcting the vision part, which is how they were actually creating this economical imbalance within the society, and the other type of contamination in behavior, which is the contamination in behavior, just like Prophet Lut's people, and where their deviation in sexuality, which is really similar to the LGBTQIA, is actually considered a deviation and a contamination in behavior that will affect one's spirituality. And of course, you'll talk about so many different types. And when we're talking about the contamination in sincerity, we're looking at where someone might actually do it for the sake of people, one might do it for the sake of their own, let me call it mundane growth, and not for their religious growth, not for their connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So now you're looking at what makes a spiritual decay. Again, a vision, you're looking at the vision, behavior, and you're looking at the sincerity. And the one of the things that when we look at, so how do I know if there's a spiritual contamination? So I've got the fitra, but a lot of things when you're looking at the behavior, not being able to distinguish right from wrong tells us when a person gets into that behavioral contamination, it becomes too frequent. That's why the Prophet ﷺ actually said that the fitan, the different trials, the different, let's call them contaminators, they would be exposed on the heart, and to the heart, that is, and then the heart, the Prophet ﷺ in this hadith actually made this example and laid out this example in where it's as if the heart is actually layered with a type of, it's like a type of a mat or a covering. But then he actually explained that it's like a hay mat, and this hay mat, it allows water and it allows many things to actually seep through the different fibers in the hay strings, because they're not, as when we're looking at trying to conceal something and cover something, it's totally different when you get from one substance to another. But the Prophet ﷺ is giving us that example, that it's like the heart is covered with a hay mat, and then whenever the heart itself finds that fitna, or that contamination coming in, it starts absorbing it. And the place that absorbed this contamination, it actually leaves a black mark in the heart. Now, this black mark in the heart is actually explained in Surah Al-Mutaffifin, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ. And look at that wording of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and verily their hearts had become rusted, because of, look at the word, مَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ, because of the action that they were putting in. In other words, what was it? It was basically a behavioral contamination. Remember, so when we looked at the vision contamination, now it's talking about the behavioral contamination, which is really similar here. When we look at behavioral contamination, what happens when a person does a certain behavior is that it gets normalized, and a person gets accustomed to that behavior, and then they start seeing it as, so what's wrong with it? And that's where right now the indoctrination is actually coming in where it's normalizing the behavior, and then later the hearts become so contaminated that, hey, I don't see anything wrong with it, why are you against this? It puts in a certain narrative, and then the contamination becomes so common, becomes so common, and of course so predominant within the society. Then the society starts being losing their ability to find the vision, the purity, the spirituality in vision. And that the danger is not only in the behavior, but is also in finding the clarity in vision. So that's where, think of that. Well, that's where when you look at the contaminators in vision, contaminators in behavior, that's where the confusion comes in, and the person is lost in many paths and trying out many paths in search of answers to life. So they'll start making, and this is really important to mention because many will actually do a lot of different things in the deen, but then they will say, well, I did it and it wasn't for me, and I'm not really sure how to understand this. I didn't feel it. But that's not how it actually happens. It's not an experiment to do where you're going to feel, whether it's bringing in, a light bulb in your head or something. It actually brings in, when it's accumulated with one another, that's how it actually brings in that spirituality, by bringing in, when you're correcting your behavior, you'll be able to be enhancing your, let me say, your spiritual connection by bringing in a vision. So think of these three different elements to help you bring in that piece of how do I connect with these different elements? Why is behavior involved, and why should it be? Why is sincerity involved, etc. So what really happens is that when a person is actually putting in the spiritual decay, in other words, their vision is contaminated, and their behavior is contaminated, and their sincerity is contaminated, that brings in the feeling of وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكَ. Stay with me here. And the Prophet, the ayah actually reads, and whoever abstains from my remembrance, as when we're talking about dhikri, it's actually involving the dhikr, the words of the Lord Almighty. But let's continue the ayah to see what is it really talking about in terms of dhikr. فإن له معيشة ضنكا, then معيشة ضنكا, then a life of confusion, which is really, the word ضنكا, trying to explain the word ضنكا. And then ونحشره, and he will be resurrected on Judgment Day. ونحشره يوم القيامة أعمى, and he will be resurrected blind. Notice that the word blind, we're going to get to it. And then he would say, قَالَ رَبِّ لِمَ حَشَرْتَنِي أَعْمَى. He would say, what, Lord Almighty, so why did you resurrect me blind when I was capable of seeing? So he said, that is because when the words and the verses had come to you, the revelation had come to you, نسيتها. قال كذلك أتتك آياتنا فنسيتها. You had forgotten the revelation, and today you will be forgotten. Now I want you to emphasize the part when it actually says the word dhikr, and then it uses the word uses the word that he was actually blinded. Why was he blinded? Because it went to the original center of what makes a spiritual decay, which is the vision. So what really happened is that when the vision went away, when that person had that visual decay, let's say it that way, the vision part, in where the contamination in their vision, that's when it basically affected their what? It affected their ability to remember the dhikr and apply it in their life. So that, let's look at the ayah again. We're gonna put it in perspective again. وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي, and whoever abstains from dhikri. So the word dhikri in this situation is not only the dhikr in terms of just saying La ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah, and repeating that, but the word dhikr actually acts as, one, the revelation, two, the legislature that is in the that is in the revelation, and three, the sincerity in where the person is applying that dhikr, and which is why it emphasized dhikri, the repetition that you would actually apply dhikr in. فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكَ وَنَحْشُرُهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ أَعْمَى. They will be resurrected as blind. And then he would say, why am I resurrected blind when I was actually able to see? But then he said, كذلك أتتك آياتنا فنسيتها. The word فنسيتها, you had forgotten it, is actually telling us that when you look at that forgetting part, it was emphasizing mind. Why was it emphasizing mind? Because when you look at what is equivalent to vision, and then behavior, and then the sincerity part, which is the what we were laying out earlier, it's really the aql, the mind. So the person did not contemplate, and then he said فَنَسِيتَهَا. Nisyan is actually supposed to be in mind. Did this person necessarily forget it? It's not that he forgot the words, because generally you shouldn't be held accountable for forgetting something because it's supposed to be beyond your capacity. But when you look at the ayah, it says وَكَذَلِكَ الْيَوْمَ تُنْسَى. You would see that it's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and today you will be forgotten. It's not that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so this is right now a wrong translation. Even though the word is actually كَذَلِكَ الْيَوْمَ تُنْسَى, it actually comes from the same root as nasitaha, but the word here that the person disregarded, in other words, they were pacified away from looking at the words, at the revelation with the correct vision. What was it? It was really their behavior. The behavior made them disregard and lose the vision to see the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, and كَذَلِكَ الْيَوْمَ تُنْسَى, meaning, and today not you will be forgotten, but you will be disregarded. You will be disregarded. In other words, you will be left without any care, without any mercy, because you had actually left the connection with the spiritual part, which is the dhikr part, which is the remembering the Lord Almighty's path. So what ends up increasing? Sadness, depression, and anxiety ends up decreasing within the society, and which is why there is an emphasis. I know that many times we could see that we could see a lot of the specialists in therapy and mental illness. They would always try to say, well, no, you can't always correlate, the different signs of mental health with religion and etc., which is true to many situations, but at many times it can be correlated. And that's why in the Quran there is actually an emphasis on that. It doesn't mean that a person, because of attending or needing or probably being diagnosed with depression, it doesn't necessarily mean that the person is spiritually decay. Just to make sure that we understand this correctly. But at the same time, it does actually help, and it can actually be one of the signs. So part of the symptoms of having spiritual decay is actually one of the symptoms is depression, but it doesn't mean that a person with depression is reflecting a spiritual decay. So حذيفة روح غاد يا ماما أنا بقدرش أسوي بالصوت هيك. So when we have to make sure that we lay out things in a way that is actually let me say reasonable with the situations, and we don't want any confusion in where we would think if a person's going through depression, that means they've got a spiritual decay. No, one of the signs of spiritual decay is depression, but it doesn't mean that anybody that is going through anxiety or depression is actually that they are actually dealing with that because of spiritual decay. So the other part, why do we actually say that? And why is let's call the psychological part is emphasized in Islam? frequently in the Quran. So let's look at a number of different words. So you could see right there, rana ala qulubihim. There's this covering in the heart. There's a covering on the heart, and of course there's that actually has this reflection on a person and how they're feeling towards themselves. And let's see what else. Danka, and the word ma'ishatan danka is actually talking about this life, not about the akhirah. That they'll actually have a life in this life where they will feel a type of depression and anxiety within their life. At the same time, you could see that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that the believers, that they don't feel fear and they don't feel the sorrow. So you could see there are a number of different things, although someone might debate that this is actually talking about the akhirah, or a lot of them talking about the akhirah, but it still is correct if we were to say that this is also according to many mufassirin, that it's also speaking about it in dunya. So ma'ishatan is actually talking about life, and that الذين آمنوا لا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون, it's also talking about this life and not only the akhirah. So when we speak about, of course, we did cover all this. The reasons for spiritual decay is usually when we talked about, remember, the vision, the behavior, and of course the sincerity. Many times the vision is really lost because of lost in focus, that is, because of lust and personal motives, which is actually emphasized in the word nafs in the Quran. And the other part, which is suspicion. So suspicion, that actually requires, when we're talking about suspicion, in where the person has a lot of misconceptions and they're not understanding how to answer those questions. So that's a suspicion where it requires a research, it requires knowledge, and that's related to the vision. It needs a different path right there. So not only spiritual, but we need to do some let's say some education right there. The other thing is anger, because anger, it affects the person's principle and how they can maintain and contain the principle that they're living in. Why? Because their emotions take over, the feelings take over. And when we actually speak about a spiritual development, it's really important to mention that using all the capacities for Allah Almighty and fulfilling the duties with sincerity and obedience to Him alone Almighty. So what does that really mean? We're looking at vision, behavior, and sincerity. So what actually makes a spiritual development? When your vision is focused and is coming from the center of Allah Almighty, and the behavior is actually putting in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's words, you're living the principle of Allah Almighty. And then finally your sincerity, in where you're connecting yourself with Allah Almighty and not with dunya, that's what actually brings in spirituality. And I'm going to go really quick because, okay, so what are the ways for attending spiritual development? Many times I would get sisters that'll telling me, I was trying to do Qiyam al-Layl, but I couldn't do Qiyam al-Layl, and I keep losing out, I keep missing out. I wasn't sure how to grow and how to be able to be consistent with it. All right? You think of the spiritual elevators and think about the spiritual refrainments, things that you have to stay away from. And the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Ma amartukum bihi fa'tu minhu mastata'tum." What I ordered you to do, what I ordered you to do. And what I ordered you to abstain from, then abstain from it entirely. So what does that mean? If you look at the hadith, it actually emphasized the spiritual refrainment before even bringing in the spiritual elevators. In fact, the spiritual elevators are basically, think of it as a spring. And when we're talking about a spring, the springs that are the coils, like the coil, and the coil, you press on it in order for it to jump. And the more you press on it, the higher it jumps. All right. So think of it as the coil. And those are when you press on it, think of it as pressing and giving up on the spiritual refrainments. And when you're jumping and making that coil jump, those are the spiritual elevators. So, what is a spiritual refrainment? Well, the spiritual refrainments, those are basically in two different categories. There's the major sins and there are the minor sins. So what do they actually do? Each and every single one of these sins rubs on the person differently. So a person that is involved in riba, the way that they would relate with their spirituality is going to be different than a person that is involved with zina. A person that is involved with probably a major sin, right, is going to be relating with their spirituality and struggling with their spirituality differently, and definitely it's going to be harder on them to bring about a focus. For example, remember we're talking about focus, behavior, and sincerity. It's harder for them to bring about a focus if they're actually involved in a major sin than in a minor sin. The major sin has a higher gravity on the person in the way it basically acts as an addicting piece, an addicting piece, and of course the way it the even the destruction it has on the society is even bigger. Now, what are the major sins? Now, I want you to look at these parts when we talk about the deen, nafs, aql, ard, mal. So we're just going to go really quick. What do we mean by major sins? And what is this deen, nafs, aql, ard, mal? This is actually right there. You got to memorize this. And in this category, the way you would memorize your name. DNAIM. The way you memorize their name, this is going to help you understand everything in Islam. This is just like when you look at the vertebra, the vertebra in your spine. That's what's helping you. And even in the vertebra in the spine, you would see, for example, L1 and L2, and certain parts in the spine are responsible for the function of the brain, the function of the heart, the function of the limbs, the function, and depending on the area within the spine, the area of, let's say, if we're talking about a herniated disc or we're talking about that, it's going to affect certain parts in your body. And that's exactly the same thing. That's exactly the same thing. In where if the contamination was in the deen, or let's say, call it a degeneration this time, okay, because we're comparing it with a spine. If the degeneration was in the deen, you're going to see a certain type of spiritual decay. If the contamination was in, or the degeneration was in the way a person is dealing with his life or his body and his health, you're going to see a different reflection. You're going to see a different symptom, let's say it that way. If the degeneration was in the mind and the mental health, you're going to see a different symptom in the body or in the mind, and so forth. If the degeneration was in chastity, you're going to see a different degeneration in the behavior, in the society, and the list goes on and on. And then we've got the degeneration in the way one is dealing with money, whether it's overspending or where they're getting their money from, and it becomes that degeneration in spirituality without one recognizes. So when you're looking at the religiosity, the vision, when you're looking at the mind, chastity, and wealth, those are actually exactly like the spine. Exactly like the spine, where each one is responsible for one thing, responsible for one thing. And that's why when we actually speak about spirituality in Islam, we cannot separate it whatsoever from fiqh, from understanding the main foundation of what makes Islam and what makes the principle in Islam. So whatsoever, you cannot speak about spirituality as if it was a separate thing from behavior. It's actually part of it. So that's why when we speak about the major sins, for example, the first one is actually associating partners with Allah Almighty. The second one is killing or even harming your body. So when we speak about nafs, we're not just talking about killing somebody, but we're actually talking about even harming the body without you recognizing. So obesity, for example, is actually relating to one and how they harm their body, and then it induces and increases their connection with the world, and it makes it harder for them to put in probably ibadah, put in different actions of dhikr, dhikr, because they've been feeding their body too much that they can't really give up on many things. And the body gets so connected and so tied with a lot of the mundane things, and let's call it the gravity of the world, that it becomes harder for them to actually perform certain duties, harming your own or others' body, for example. And of course, when we're talking about chastity here, or fornication or adultery, it's actually affecting the person's focus. And that's why Islam didn't actually just tell you, you just don't do and don't engage in zina, but it actually went farther and said, even how you see and what you see in things, that's actually involved, and that's going to increase if you look at the wrong things, whether we're talking about porn or we're talking about things that are they're not appropriate. What does it do? It basically starts putting in a different power in the major sins and their ability to overcome you. It becomes a different magnet that's harming you. It becomes an addiction. So zina becomes an addiction. Drinking becomes an addiction. Drugs become an addiction. And the stronger the addiction, the stronger you could see Islam recommending and pressuring you to not approach those areas, because it will be a lot harder for you to keep away and keep out of those areas. So Islam was telling you, well, wait a minute, it's going to actually be a big contamination, and then you're going to need, if that contamination did happen, you're going to need stronger detox. And if you need stronger detox, it's going to take longer time, it's going to take more and more effort, and it's going to take more and more determination for the detox. Because putting in a detox, or let's say the drinking or the drug programs, all right, when we're looking at the drug programs, there's a whole list of the different things that they might actually give you certain drugs just to help you gradually abstain from it, because the intoxication was so strong that it basically affected your ability to separate yourself away from it. And the chances are, a lot of these people that end up in the drug programs or end up taking drugs, the addiction was so strong that they actually end up coming in the drug program many, many, many times, because of the severity and the strong addiction that it actually has on the person. So a person that went through all this, the jahiliyyah, the stronger it is on the person, the more effort it needs to get into that detox. And that's why Islam was emphasizing even on sight sins and hearing sins and all the different behavioral sins and the talking and etc. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Amsik alayka hada," was telling Mu'adh, hold on to this, your tongue, hold it, because if it's actually speaking on the wrong things, it's going to be taking you into that slippery road, and then sucks you into a different world. And without you realizing, you're going to be sucked in this black hole of a major sin that has a strong gravity, where it would probably take the highest powers and the highest strengths in order to detox yourself, or at least free yourself away from its gravity. So when you look at those things, the stronger the gravity and the stronger of the addiction, the more effort you need to put. So where do I start with all this? Well, if a person is actually involved in major sins and minor sins, we would say, well, work on your minor sins in order to help you face the major sins. So it works both ways. Work on this in order to help you with that, because you're not going to be able to stop entirely from all the gravity that was built throughout all these years. It's going to be extremely hard for you. So what should I do? Change the society first. Change the people you're involved with. Change your friends. Change what you look at. And all that environment, by changing it, you will be able to bring in a new vision. You'll be able to put in a new behavior, and that will bring in the sincerity and the strength and the sincerity. But usually it's the friends, or it's the peers, that is, the peers that bring in a certain environment that puts in a certain behavior. Changing your friends is actually one very important step. The people that you hang out with. The people that you hang out with, it's really changing what you expose yourself to. It's going to be really hard to change everything, but what you expose yourself to is really important to change, because that's going to change. Remember, what you expose yourself to is basically the vision. Working on the vision. What are you looking at? What are you putting yourself in? That's going to change your behavior. And that's why it's really important to emphasize this internet entertainment industry and the movies is absolutely not something that is, let's call it Muslim friendly, spiritual friendly. It doesn't work. If you're actually exposing your life to that certain lifestyle, which is introduced in a story, in movies, killing and zina and drinking, and the hero becomes a person that has a that is engaging in all those different spiritual contaminations, there's no way that you're gonna grow in your spirituality if your vision is actually exposed to that lifestyle. There's no way. And your behavior, you're not going to be able to change it if you're exposing yourself to the movies and their lifestyle, even if it's presented as if it was just a story, or it's actually stronger than that. The the movies and the way that they had destructed the society is one thing for us to learn, that this is not suiting whatsoever a Muslim. It doesn't suit a Muslim whatsoever. Same thing when we're looking at, in order for you to change the behavior, you're going to change what you're looking at. And then later, you're going to find yourself. And if you notice that within the American society, for example, a lot of it is really based on certain replications, even the way people relate with one another, the jokes, the sense of humor, etc. It really is trying to replicate something within a certain movie, something within a certain show, something a celebrity is doing, etc. And then what happens, without us realizing, we're replicating everything and absorbing everything within that society that actually brings in a totally different vision. And what are the stages of spirituality? Well, the first one is Islam, which actually is attained through aql and vision. The second one, Iman, which increases. Iman is related to behavior, which increases with obedience to Allah Almighty and decreases with sin. So think of it as a coil. You give up on sin, you press on the coil, you press on yourself, you put in some form of pressure to give up on sin in order to increase your iman. Press on the coil, and that will help you jump up with your iman, and that's how you basically increase your iman, by decreasing on the amount of gravity that is actually letting you loose without you recognizing. The other part, which is taqwa. Taqwa is a different level, because it actually means you're leaving everything that is forbidden, or it takes you from a forbidden path. And in other words, you're leaving everything, even though it doesn't directly lead you a contamination, a spiritual contamination, but because it might rub off on you, because you're getting into that, think of it as a zone. If it's actually within the zone area, it's going to be telling you that, oh, it has a stronger gravity. So think of it as a zone area. All right. So taqwa is keeping away not only from the haram, but not even from the areas that might even be closer to haram. Ihsan is actually attaining the highest excellence in vision slash belief, two, in the words and actions, which is slash behavior, and three, in the thoughts, meaning the spirit, which is basically the ikhlas, the sincerity. So those are the three different things. When you're looking at it, you're bringing in Islam, Iman, and Ihsan. So looking at those. Now, when we look at spiritual elevator, think of the coil again. You're pressing against the gravity and against the coil, and the coil goes up. Those are the spiritual elevators, and there's a difference between how Islam connects with faith and action. And then it tells you, well, in order to grow in your spiritual elevator, in order to grow in your ability to probably put in more siyam, or probably put in more salah, or even probably make salah. You don't have to probably put in more. What happens? You basically would have to give up on the spiritual refrainments. All right, takhliya. You're gonna let go of a lot of those different things, and that's how you would grow in your tazkiyah right there. So the road to tahliya, what do we do? So again, the faith, mind in Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "Al-Iman bid'un wa sab'una shu'bah." Now, Iman, he said, is actually a couple and 70. A couple and 70, not shab'a, but shu'bah. Sorry, shu'bah actually means branches. So the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that even faith is not all the same. It's actually in different branches. It's actually in different stages. That is, the highest one is La ilaha illallah. Why? Because that's the vision. And the lowest one of those is imatatul adha an tariq. It's basically picking up any garbage off the ground. So what is it? Imatatul adha an tariq is telling us that it's a behavior, right? So Islam involves a faith, and it involves an action. And the other part, which is basically, now we're going from mind to body. ألا وإن في الجسد لمضغة. Verily, there's a piece of flesh in the heart that if it gets contaminated, the rest of the body is contaminated. If it is pure, the rest of the body actually gets pure with it, in which is the heart. Now the third one, which is ruh, it actually increases with intentions, with spirituality, with focus, with sincerity. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ. All the actions. In other words, don't just focus on behavior. There's a very important thing to focus on, which is intentions. إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ وَإِنَّمَا لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مَا نَوَى. So the Prophet ﷺ emphasizes that and said all the actions are really weighed and measured based on the intentions. In other words, what really makes a value of any action is not just the behavior itself, but is actually the amount of sincerity involved within it, put within it. That's going to increase the person's faith right there in spirituality. So what are the spiritual elevators? When you're looking at spiritual elevators, of course, we're looking at, again, the DNAIM that I actually said earlier, in where, of course, when we're looking at the first thing, which is Tawheed, which is correcting the vision, and two, basically the different actions that correlate with it as well. So performing, and in order to start with your spiritual elevators, you actually start with the pillars of Islam. So whether it's praying 5 times a day, or whether it's fasting, which basically, when we're looking at 5 times a day, it's basically getting you within the discipline and within the increasing your ability to focusing on Allah Almighty. And then the fasting element is in order to help you shift from the body containment to actually bringing in the spiritual power within you, and bringing in giving up for the sake of Allah Almighty. And then charity, which is zakah, is really in order to give up on dunya and your love for basically ownership, into cooperating, of course, with the rest of the community, and in order to put in that piece of shifting the focus from wanting dunya to wanting principle. Why am I giving zakah? Even though I love ownership, it feels good to have all that money in your bank account, but you're giving up on the money in your bank account and putting in that giving principle in order to feel that there's something more valuable than the money that you have, which is the principle that you gain. The principle that you gain is more valuable than the money that you gave up on. And of course, pilgrimage in order to enhance. It's probably something, so it feels good for many people to say, I'm an introvert, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is actually encouraging you to be within the society and to work on your coping skills and work on creating a bond within the society and creating a Muslim brotherhood. And that's when, of course, how do we actually attain all this? It needs more and more mujahada. It needs more and more workout. It needs more and more workout in order to be able to fight again against our own comfort zone. This is really important to mention because many want to just stay, I'm comfortable like this, I don't want to change, it feels good. But if you don't work on your comfort zone and getting out of your comfort zone into a better and a more important comfort zone, because that's what leads you to success in dunya and akhirah, then you're going to let your body keep on taking you into its type of comfort, and then it becomes addicting without you recognizing. So just to note these things. So what also helps with getting that spiritual elevator? Dhikr. La ilaha illallah, subhanallah, alhamdulillah. Doing that dhikr, the morning dhikr, the noon dhikr, the afternoon dhikr, all that actually enhances your ability to be able to build stronger connections. The forms of worship in Islam, think of worship as spiritual elevators. There's the spiritual ones in where you're doing dhikr, which actually means remember the Lord Almighty, istighfar, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم. And he was actually, by the way, that ayah, الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, this is not talking about the level of Islam. Remember when we talked about the level of Islam, the level of Iman, the level of Ihsan. So الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, this is actually talking about the level of mu'min. That when the names of Allah Almighty, the name of Allah Almighty is mentioned, their hearts tremble. That's a level of Iman. All right? Why not a level of Islam? The level of Islam is just a threshold. The level of Iman relates to the heart. The level of Islam relates to the mind. The level of the heart, qulubuhum, that relates to the heart. So the behavior affects the heart. So what behavior did they induce here? The behavior that they induced is remembrance of Allah Almighty. Remembrance is actually in the heart. It's in the mind. It's on the inside. I remembered. But then they would do dhukir Allah here when someone is mentioning it to them. In other words, the mention of the name Allah, they recognize the power of the Lord Almighty, and that's why their hearts trembled, because they had already gained a strong vision of the Lord Almighty's powers with their Islam. Because when you're looking at Islam, they're understanding the powers of and the magnificence of the Lord Almighty. So their hearts, they trembled because they felt the power of the name of the Lord Almighty. You see it right there? And that comes in. We're going to see it. Maybe I could actually jump to it right now. Maybe I shouldn't be jumping. Okay, let's just stick to this one. All right, so the spiritual part in where what brings it in, you got the certain spiritual actions istighfar, dhikr, etc. And then repentance, reading Quran brings it in because it corrects the vision. But of course, it's not just an issue of reading Quran. Yes, it's a blessing, but you also need to work on understanding it and bringing in the dua. The other parts, and when we look at, let me, oops. All right. So other things that we remember is that there are actually physical actions that relate to spiritual capacity. I'm actually going to get to the point. Hold on. I'm going to get to a very important. Hold on. Okay, this is the slide that I actually wanted to get to. So I want you to look at this one, in where when you look at this model, please take a screenshot because it's going to explain a lot. All right, look at this level. You've got the level of Islam, you've got the level of Iman, you've got the level of Ihsan. All right, maybe I should have started put them right there. So what is the difference? All right, what is the level of Islam really in order to get to the level of Islam? The person is working on their mind. They're contemplating with their mind on basically trying to figure out the existence of God, the meaning for their existence, and then they would answer a lot of the misconceptions that are out there. And what are they really fighting? They're really fighting a lot of the speculation that is put out there. The speculation where a lot of it is really not based on fact, but then a lot of it is actually confused with the different things. But I want to look at this one. So Islam is really putting in, so after the person lets go of the different speculations, the different misconceptions, then their mind comes to a level of, let's call it a level of mental spirituality, and they would connect themselves with existence, connect themselves. In other words, they have a closer connection with Allah Almighty by recognizing the Lord Almighty's existence. The level of Iman is actually different, because the level of Iman, the person is relating with their heart, all right, because this is another step. So the person in the level of Iman, they were capable of getting stronger in their actions, by recognizing the actions of Allah Almighty. So what does that mean? They recognize that the Lord Almighty, for example, is Ar-Raziq, that the Lord Almighty is the one that cherishes. So what do? They put in the principle of working for Allah Almighty over their job. So they would leave probably, that moment of trying to work. Oh, what happened? Okay, here we go. Trying to focus on their dunya, and then they would change the behavior by recognizing the actions and the actions of Allah Almighty, Ar-Razzaq, for example. They would recognize the powers of Allah Almighty, so that increases their Iman, increases their spirituality, and they will sense it in their heart. How do they actually attain the level of Iman? By giving up on the desires. In the level of Islam, they're giving up on the misconceptions. In the level of Iman, they're giving up on a lot of the desires that act as this gravity that's pulling them. Where are the desires? And the desires are really in the word nafs. You will find it in the word nafs, or in the hawa that is there. The hawa and the nafs, the desires and the different, that is really the gravity of the nafs right there, is what's keeping our Iman growing. So in order for us to grow in our Iman, we need to recognize the names of Allah Almighty, and especially the names that relate to action. So if you look at the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, some of the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are relating to action. So Ar-Razzaq, for example, all right, you've got certain names that relate to actions, and certain names that relate to Allah Almighty Himself. So those are the names. So there are names, and there are sifat. There are descriptions, and there are names, and you've got the descriptions are basically describing Allah Almighty's actions and powers. So when one understands those, that's when a person is going to start recognizing them recognizing the power of the Lord Almighty by recognizing Allah Almighty in action. They're recognizing it all around them. And that's when they develop a spiritual sense with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's powers by recognizing His powers, His actions in the world around that person. Now, the other part, which is ihsan. Ihsan is recognizing really the names of Allah Almighty and not the actions. That's a harder thing to recognize. It's like and which is why if you look at the hadith where where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, "An ta'bud Allah ka'annaka tara." It's like worshiping Allah as if you could see Allah. He was talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Allah Almighty in Himself, in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Himself, but not, we don't do anthropomorphization. In other words, we're not going to, make an image of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because as human beings we know that we can't get an image of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with the names and the descriptions. All right, and that's why he said أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. He didn't say الرزاق, he didn't say الخالق. All right, Al-Khaliq is recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the actions. That's making, that's the creator. All right, that's Al-Khaliq. Al-Raziq, those are based on actions. But in ihsan, you'll recognize the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You'll recognize the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are Dhul Quwwati wal Jabarut, for example. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a Sami'. All right, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is capable, that He is all hearing. All right, even though that actually relates to an action. Let me think. Okay, now I'm all over the place. All right, so what actually brings in what Allah, for example, is one of the things for the names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's not an action. So Allah is not an action. It's relating to a name. Al-Quddus. Al-Quddus, the most sanctuary, is basically a name, and it's not relating to a behavior. Malik al-Quddus. As-Salam, it's relating to, As-Salam brings in the peace, that's an action. Al-Mu'min, Al-Muhaymin, Al-Muhaymin, it's relating to a name. He's all the authority goes to Him. So anyhow, so let's go ahead. For the ihsan, it affects the person's soul, spirit. And then how is that attained? That's attained with guidance. And that's why if you follow along with us in Surah Al-Baqarah, we're actually looking at, this is the foundation. This is the foundation of the tafsir for Surah Al-Baqarah. Right there, and where it's laying out the foundation of how you understand spiritual elevation. How is that attained? Well, that's attained with guidance, and more guidance in visual guidance, behavioral guidance, and sincerity. So this comes in with sincerity, and that's the highest level of spirituality. So this is the end for today, inshallah, even though I really wanted to talk about the nafs, but I don't know, do we actually, wait, where's my nafs slide? Here's my nafs slide. So that's probably something we'll talk about next week, the nafs slide, inshallah. So what is a nafs? Yeah, well, inshallah. All right, I'd be happy to answer any questions. Sorry if I took too long, and I hope I didn't go in huge circles to explain something, one small thing. So here's a question. So do you or do you not agree with the Khilafah? If you don't agree, why don't you support it? What? No. No. This is not understanding what I'm saying. Okay, no. Khilafah, this is not talking about every Muslim has to work towards bringing in the Khilafah, the Muslim governance, Muslim power. Every Muslim has to agree with that. And this is not a slogan to say, all right? The problem, and this is relating to Hizb ut-Tahrir, the problem with Hizb ut-Tahrir is not with the slogan. And it is with the slogan. The problem with Hizb ut-Tahrir is that they're laying out a slogan, but no fi'l, but no action. No Muslim disagrees with wanting Muslim governance whatsoever. In fact, any Muslim that disagrees with wanting a Muslim governance is actually not Muslim anymore, because the Quran is actually telling us you have to rule by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The problem with Hizb ut-Tahrir is that they put in a slogan but no action to get to that. You can yell out all day long, Khilafah, 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 and we want that, but it's not what's going to bring it. Yelling out Khilafah is not what's going to bring the Islamic governance, and is not going to bring in, changing and talking about the way a structure of the Khilafah or a structure of governance happens, what the duties of the Khalifa are, and the minister, and what kind of currency we should be using. That's not our problem right there. This is all secondary compared to what do we do in order to bring it on ground? This is my problem with Hizb ut-Tahrir, because I'm sure the question is relating to Hizb ut-Tahrir, so I'm answering that one. So here's another one. I have a question. What order do the 5 pillars of Islam come in? What order? Every time I see the 5 pillars, it says zakat comes before fasting, but I believe fasting comes before zakat. So actually, the hadith actually puts in zakat before fasting, and that's why you would see in the Quran, iqam as-salat, ita az-zakat. All right, iqam as-salat, ita az-zakat. All right, so zakat actually comes first, and they were called the sisters. They were called the sisters of ibadah in Islam. All right, so it's actually zakah before siyam. All right, so I hope I answered those questions, and Allah يعطيكم العافية جميعا, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you all high spirituality, give us all high spirituality, me including, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us the ability to also get the spirituality to be able to face the different, let's call them the different gravities that are taking us away from being able to jump and elevate in our spirituality. If anybody would like to say anything, I'd be happy to hear. Oh, here's another one. What if someone does pray, fast, gives zakat, doesn't drink, and all that, but also attends exercise classes for ladies only, and they have music? So music is actually not, if it's only ladies, okay, music is not a major sin. It's not a major sin. It's actually a minor sin. All right. And there's a whole, I think I've actually explained the issue of music in detail. I would recommend that the sister would, attend a place where I would say it, fully Islam friendly. And what I really fear is that part, I don't know what is being said in music, but you can probably encourage them. Can we put, let's say, at least, okay, because not all music is haram, but you can probably, recommend at least putting a type of music that is, saying, there's a difference between, certain country music and between rock and roll, and, the type of music that's encouraging haram behavior is different than the type of music in where it's speaking about, somebody that battled cancer and what they did. You understand what I'm saying? So you can probably recommend a type of music that is encouraging us to do good and bring in good principle. All right, so it depends on what we're talking about. So that's that's a whole, I don't know what the environment of that is, but if you feel it on the inside, the environment is not right, by all means bring in your equipment, and at least some equipment, whatever you could afford, to your own home if you can, and engage in that. So yeah, let's see, the 5, okay, so I hope I answered that one. And if there's anyone else that would, all right, so if anybody else would like to, I guess, unmute themselves and comment, say anything, I would be happy to listen. I guess no one wants to say anything. Are they allowed? What's her name? Huma, are they allowed? Are you are they allowed? Are they given the ability to talk at all? I have no idea. I guess, I don't know. All right. So I guess we'll end right there, and jazakumullah khairan everyone, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Oh no? Okay. All right, assalamu alaikum everyone.